Welcome to another episode of 10 with Tom, where we explore faith 10 minutes at a time. Today we're talking about prayer and fasting. Why and how do we do it? So the first thing I want to do is explain what fasting actually is, and then I'm going to give you 5 kind of practical tips or things to know about fasting. So what is fasting? Well, fasting is essentially going without something for a period of time. There's a lot of kind of buzz these days around. You may have heard intermittent fasting, where people will eat in like an 8-hour window and then fast for the other 16. But we're not really talking about fasting as like a dietary weight loss habit here. We're talking about prayer and fasting. I remember with the whole intermittent fasting, an older guy said to me, you guys call it intermittent fasting, we just called it skipping breakfast. So, but that's not really what we're talking about. From a spiritual biblical perspective, Nathan Foster says it well. Fasting is the voluntary denial of an otherwise normal function, example eating, for the sake of intense spiritual activity. It's not just fasting for fasting's sake, but it's rather biblical fasting always centers or points towards a spiritual purpose. Now, ordinarily, when we think of fasting, we think about fasting from food. And that's most of the time in the Bible what it's speaking about. But fasting, we can fast from anything. We can fast from media and technology, from our phones. We can fast from, noise, people, hurry. We can fast from coffee. Dear God, help us. We can fast from a bunch of things. We can fast from, as I said, technology, our phones. It doesn't really matter what we fast, because why we fast is far more important. So that's where I get to my first point about fasting. And the first thing is this: fasting is not earning. We do not fast to earn brownie points with God or to earn favor with God. We fast because we already have His favor. And it's simply just a practice or a discipline that helps us to be aware of God's work in our lives and to draw closer to Him. Fasting does not make you a better Christian. Just a hungrier Christian. Fasting is not, thanks Gary for laughing there. Fasting is not a commandment, it's a practice. But let me say this. If you read Jesus' teaching and His words, it would seem that Jesus assumed that fasting was part and parcel of a Christ follower's life, as much as prayer or giving or gathering. Jesus states, when you fast, it would seem that He kind of assumes that people will fast, and then He goes on to give instructions on how to do it well. Also, if you look at who fasted in the scriptures, it's like a who's who of the Bible. Abraham's servant when he was seeking a bride for Isaac, Moses on Mount Sinai, Hannah when she prayed for a child, David, Elijah, Ezra, Nehemiah when he was preparing for his trip back to Israel, Esther when she was faced with having to face the king. We spoke about that on Sunday if you missed that message. Daniel on numerous occasions. Even Jesus, as He began His public ministry in the desert, He fasted. Paul at the point of his conversion, the early Christians in the early church at Antioch, prayer and fasting was part and parcel. On and on I could go. It was part of the Christian life. But again, not to earn God's favor, but because we already have God's favor. The second point about fasting is that fasting is about focus. First and foremost, fasting should draw us or point us towards God. Richard Foster, in his wonderful book, Spiritual Disciplines, wrote this: fasting must forever center on God. It must be God-initiated and God-ordained. So we don't fast to lose weight or to feel better about ourselves. We don't fast to get something from God. We fast to focus on God. Fasting is about focus. It's intentionally depriving our physical bodies as a reminder. And more than any other single discipline, I think fasting reveals what controls us. Let me say that again. Fasting reveals what can so easily control us. So here's the truth. We often cover up what is inside of us with food and other good, things. But fasting brings these things to the surface. If pride controls us, it will be revealed immediately as we fast. David said in Psalm 69, I humbled my soul with fasting. Anger, bitterness, jealousy, fear, if they're in us, they are often kind of surface during fasting. And we can justify and say we're angry because we're hungry, or we're fasting, we're hangry. I get hangry a lot. But actually, the reason we're angry is because anger is within us. And fasting can bring that to the surface. Fasting reminds us, let me say that again. Fasting reveals what can so easily control us. And it reminds us that we are sustained by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That's in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4. Food does not sustain us. God sustains us. And Jesus said this in the desert, my food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work. As the theologian Dallas Willard, in his classic book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, he says this: fasting confirms our utter dependence upon God by finding Him in a source of sustenance beyond food. The third thing about fasting is not magic. It's not some magic wave your wand formula that's going to fix things. Adele Cahoon writes this. She says, fasting is not a magical way to manipulate God into doing our will. It's not a way to get God to be an accomplice in our plans. Neither is fasting a spiritual way to lose weight or control others. Fasting clears us out and opens us up to intentionally seeking God's will and grace in a way that goes beyond normal habits of worship and prayer. Fasting is an opportunity to lay down an appetite for food, for media, for shopping. And this act of self-denial, I love what she says, may not seem huge. It's just a meal or a trip to the mall, but it brings us face to face with the hunger at the core of our being. Fasting is not a magic formula to fix our problems or get our prayers answered, but there is something, I think, incredibly powerful about denying ourselves and then allowing God to speak to us in our hunger, spiritually, mentally, emotional hunger, in our emptiness. And so while practically fasting is not magical, I do think its outcomes are supernatural. Number 4, fasting is for balance. It's so easy to our lives to kind of get off kilter, to just become too busy, too worried, so many things going on. And it's so easy to allow non-essential things to kind of take precedence in our lives. I'm sure you've found that. And we can quickly crave things that we don't need, and then those things enslave us in the end. So fasting helps us to keep a balanced life. Paul wrote, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Our human cravings and our desires are like a river that tends to overflow the banks from time to time, and fasting helps to keep them in their proper channel. Paul writes, I pummel my body and subdue it. David writes, I afflicted myself with fasting. That is discipline, and discipline ultimately brings freedom. We tend to think of discipline as a limit to our freedom, like don't tell me what I can or can't do, but actually that's because we truly don't understand what freedom really is. And that brings me to my final point, point number 5 about fasting and prayer, is that fasting is for freedom. Fasting is for freedom. See, our culture tells us freedom is simply an absence of constraint, but that's not what freedom is, being free to just do whatever you want. No, what freedom is I discipline my body. I purposely limit myself by having to exercise. I purposely watch what I eat, and that's a discipline, but what that discipline does is it frees me to be healthy. It frees me to feel good about myself. It frees me to be able to run around with my boys and my kids and not get tired. And so discipline, yes, it may limit us in the moment, but it ultimately creates a far greater freedom in the long run. It's short-term pain for long-term gain. So ultimately, fasting is about bringing freedom, not about restriction. It's being free to know who you are and whose you are. Being free to know that you are a child of God, loved by the Father. Not reliant upon, not dependent upon all these other cravings and desires that can so easily ensnare us. So fasting is not earning, fasting is about focus, fasting is not magic, fasting is for balance, and fasting is for freedom. I hope that's helpful. I hope it makes sense. Just quick things before we close the video. I don't know how we're doing on time here, but just 2 practical tips. The first is don't make a big deal about it. I used to do that when I first fasted. Oh, sorry, I can't have that. I'm fasting. I'll pray for you in your soul. Like we can get all or we get all tired and what's wrong? Oh, I'm fasting. Like woe is me. I mean, Jesus is clear, Matthew 6. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. So when we fast, let's just get on with it. And then the second thing is be still and listen. Try to find space in your day when you're fasting to be quiet, to reflect, to pray. Maybe you want to go for a walk. Maybe you want to and pray. Maybe you want to just be silent and listen. Maybe you want to journal. Whatever it is. Remember, biblical fasting always centers on spiritual purposes, not fasting for fasting's sake, but rather, that's just a hunger strike, but rather actually to focus on God. So take that time. When you get those cravings or you're feeling hungry, use it as a reminder to set your focus, fix your attention on God. As I said, I hope it's been helpful. As you experiment with prayer and fasting, my prayer is that you would know God, that you would know He is good, that you would be still and know that He is a good, good Father, and that you would experience His love and His grace in your life, and you would know that He has a plan for your life, and that ultimately, like Jesus, you would be able to say that I am sustained by every word that comes from the Father's mouth, and that my food is to do the will of the one who sent me. I pray that for you and over you today. So thanks so much for watching another episode of 10 with Tom. Please share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it or benefit from it. Also like and subscribe, and go back, watch the other episodes. Don't miss an episode. If you like and subscribe and click the bell, you'll get notified every week when our episodes come out. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.